Last videos we talked about research questions and designing research questions, formulating them, and then we talked about how to design a study, and now we're going to talk about analyzing. So we kind of talked a little bit about that in terms of prediction and explanation in the last video, so if you missed that, please do go back and review that. But in this one we're really going to talk about the more nuts and bolts about analysis and what you would do and what the different types of analysis are called. So this will be a little bit more on the jargon side than the previous videos, but do stick around for this one. Thanks a lot. I hope you enjoy. So how do you analyze these different tasks if you're looking at kind of nomothetic and more quantitative measures?
Mm-hmm.
And this is just to give you an idea of when you read something, the most, kind of common statistical techniques that we use. So if you suspect that there are differences between groups, so for example, people from different countries, that's more than two groups, then you'd probably do an ANOVA. Analysis of variance.
The worst acronym in all of psychology. Someone turned analysis of variance into ANOVA.
If you only had two groups, then you'd do a t-test. ANOVA and t-test are to look at the differences in averages between groups. And correlations, so a Pearson's bivariate correlation, for example, would be to look at whether a change in one variable is associated with a change in another variable. And that's to look at two variables. If you have more than two variables, people usually look at things like regression. So if you see regression, multiple regression, hierarchical multiple regression, then that's what they're doing. They're still looking at associations.
Yes.
So all the association ones are correlations and regressions. The ones having to do with analyzing groups is ANOVA and t-tests. And a lot of things are built on regression. So if you see things like a mediation effect, that'll be a regression. If people are using, M plus or, things like that, or structural equation modeling, or confirmatory factor analysis, those are all based on regression. But that's just to give you an idea of the kind of things that we could do. We can also look at things like a chi-square, which is looking at whether frequencies differ among kind of bins.
That's
so whether if you're a man or woman and either young or old, whether a young person who's a woman differs from an old person who's a man or something like that. So you can look at different frequencies, but those are a little bit less common in this work that we're talking about.
T-tests, ANOVAs, and regressions make up 95% of psychology.
Yeah, exactly. So just to give you an idea of a t-test, for example, this is a study that I kind of just copied their means and just graphed it for you. I would say you'd rather show this as a bar graph, but anyway, this is fine. So this was how much interviewers expended effort to obtain a confession from a suspect. And either the interrogator had a guilty suspicion or expectation or an innocent expectation. And you can see that they put a lot more effort into obtaining a confession when they thought that the person was guilty than when they thought they were innocent. However, in ANOVAs, you can do an interaction. So you can see whether another variable added in, whether it then changes this line right here that we've seen.
Ooh, two-way.
So this shows an interaction between interrogator expectation and the actual suspect's guilt or innocence in an effort to obtain confession. So it takes these numbers and splits them up into the two groups of actual guilt or actual innocence. So when they're actually guilty, the effort to obtain a confession, whether the interrogator expectation is guilty or innocent, doesn't change. But when the person's innocent, you can see that quite a bit between a guilty expectation versus an innocent expectation. So an innocent person is more likely to have a more effort expended, possibly because of the way that they're behaving and they're being really, I should cooperate because I'm not guilty. And so this shows that there could be an interaction. So the effect really doesn't affect people who are guilty. They're, probably behaving the same. They've probably had more experience with police officers and their interrogation methods. So, the kind of effort to obtain a confession is equal across the two kind of expectations of the interrogator for those kinds of people. But it's the innocent that are really damaged by by sometimes cooperating with police.
It's a very interesting example of how a two-way ANOVA reveals something very important that the one-way didn't.
Yeah, so, exactly. Yep. So a lot of people might be thinking in their research studies that there might be an interaction. Some people call it a moderating effect of another variable, so you might see moderation. That's usually in regression, but it's kind of the same concept. Interactions can happen in any of
same
those.
Math.
Same, yeah, exactly.
Same math under all those.
For prediction, it's kind of a misnomer. So as you were saying, it's really looking at an association. It's not forecasting the future.
There's no weather report for science.
So, yeah, a lot of people, I sometimes use the words statistical prediction to make that really clear that it's a statistical process. It's a math problem. Right. Correlational relationships allow psychologists to predict behavior or events. Basically, you're saying, if I know your level of depression, I might know your level of learned helplessness. Only because we've done this study with, thousands of people, and basically people with a score of 24, on average, have a helplessness score of this. So that's all it does. It's allowing you to...
And there are always exceptions.
To figure that out. Yeah, and that's just on average. So, and they might know within a certain error, kind of rate. But yeah, it doesn't allow you to know what causes those relationships. It doesn't mean that feeling helpless leads you to have depression, or the other way around. Or the other way.
Nope. Lots of other options there.
So if we know your exam scores in school, we might be able to know something about how many hours you've studied. But we wouldn't really know which one is the cause and which is the effect. It might be that if you find maths really easy, then you've studied harder for it because you find it really more exciting and rewarding.
It's interesting.
It's more interesting, and you feel less hopeless doing it.
You can tell we're nerds.
Your exam scores go up, or or it's the level of studying that directly, we don't know. Or it might be a third variable that leads to both of those. It might be that your parents are, rich, and so are, can get you exam help, from an outside agency. So and much of survey and questionnaire-based research relies on correlations and regression. So if you see somebody who's, saying they're going to use some survey measure or questionnaire measure, it's probably the case that they're going to be doing some kind of correlation or regression. And this, again, is just to kind of show you some kind of correlations that could happen. So in a study, who was this again? I think it was Kroll and Kidd, or maybe I'm thinking of another study. I don't know if I actually wrote down. Evans and colleagues here. So they found a correlation between poverty and psychological distress, but other people said, well, maybe that's not poverty causing psychological distress in a direct way. And they said maybe, it's the case that kind of chaotic environment relates to psychological distress, and also probably relates to poverty.
Yes.
Right? So they were saying, if you haven't looked at this, and because this chaos is related to poverty, you actually don't know which one is related to psychological distress.
Yeah.
And so what they tested was, this is a mediation, they tested whether poverty was related to chaos, which then was related to psychological distress.
Yep.
And turned out that that was true. So this was a kind of mediating variable here. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So the other part is explanation. So we talked about understand. So this is where we are trying to understand the cause of a phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And the cause of a phenomenon can only happen when three things are true. There is covariation, so the two things are related to each other.
Mm-hmm.
When one happens, the other one happens in some particular way. There is a time order relationship, so one preceded the other one.
Yep.
And you eliminate other possible causes or alternative explanations. So when you design an experiment, it's then really easy to be in control of those things, because you can, apply something, know the time order in which you applied it, and you can eliminate other possible causes by controlling those. So as I said, you might, if you're looking at caffeine, you might give them a coffee, but then you might want to give the other group a hot beverage that tastes of coffee, but that has no caffeine in it. Do you know what I mean? So you're trying to keep things as equal as possible. But yeah, there's the covariation. So if you bang your head and you get a headache, you banged your head first and then you got the headache. So then you know that probably banging your head gave you the headache. But then if something had happened almost at the same time that you banged your head, so you'd taken some new medication that the side effects were headaches, you actually don't know which one it was then.
Right.
So, I don't want you going around banging your head on purpose, but but these are the ways that other alternative explanations can seep into a research study.
Yeah, and I mean sometimes so don't go hit your head, but sometimes it will feel that obvious to you. If you see two things correlated, you're like, oh, they cause each other, and sometimes we find out it's not.
Yeah.
That's why it's research. We're exploring new stuff.
Yeah, and some things you can't manipulate in research. So, for example, you can't make people impoverished.
Yeah.
So, in that case, there are other things to do, but experiments are a nice way to be able to talk about explanation. So, for example, I know a guy called Jamie Pennebaker at Austin, Texas University, and he was doing some research looking at whether people who wrote in an expressive way about a traumatic event. So a bunch of people lost their jobs, for example. He has a study about job loss, and half the people were told to write about the job loss and to write it in what are their feelings, just anything that would come up, about that. Mm-hmm. And the level of distress after they did that, so the other group were just told to write about superficial topics.
Mm-hmm.
When they compared them, the people who wrote in an expressive writing kind of way were actually less distressed.
Mm-hmm.
And also what was interesting is that they were able to get jobs quicker.
Oh, okay. So that is still an experiment because you have manipulated the independent variable, which is what they're writing.
Yeah.
But interestingly, and you found an outcome, which is a distress.
Yeah.
But along the way, you've also got this mediator possibly going on. It could be that
they were at the same time, so
there's more to the outcome than you expected, though.
Yeah, there's more to the outcome. So it could be that if you're less distressed, you're then more motivated to go out and try to find jobs.
Get a job. Yeah.
So yeah, but it was an interesting experimental manipulation.
Yeah.
So yeah, and also that kind of solves some world problems with those kind of informations. Hopefully would have some kind of applied work. What I found interesting is this example that I found in this textbook, which is about typhoid fever and delirium tremens in the 19th century. So these typhoid fever and delirium were often fatal. And the standard medical practice at the time was things like bleeding the patient, as well as other therapies, because of course we didn't have well evidenced
Right. This is like the beginning of
treatment.
medical evidence
Exactly.
in systematic scientific ways. Yeah.
Exactly. So somebody designed, I think, an experiment where they were treating people either with the standard treatment, which was bleeding or purging, or the second group, which were just told to rest in their bed,
Yep.
have some tea,
Have a lie down.
wait for all of this to blow over.
Pretty much, yeah.
And they had good nutrition, right? And they did close observation of both groups. And they described the results of the experiment as unequivocal and appalling. The group given standard medical treatment of the time did worse than the group that was just in bed with no treatment. So early 19th century practices, treatment was worse than just lying in bed doing nothing, and letting them just recover on their own. So it is important to do these kind of experimental methods.
Oh, yeah.
Rather than just relying on, it must be bad air or bad blood. Another experiment was looking at the MA doll and other dolls that were more, so this is a size 16 US doll, which was made in the image of this supermodel. Because Barbies, as you might have noticed, are very disproportional to what real women look like. And so they did an experiment with girls.
But I actually look like the Hercules doll, right?
No. So they did an experiment with 5 to 6 year olds, and they read a book where the protagonist was Barbie, and Barbie went shopping and getting ready for a party. And in another condition, they had a different book, and it had MA doing all those things. So same things, same story, but MA was placed in there instead of Barbie.
Sounds like an experiment. What was the outcome?
No, there was a third condition.
Oh, Lord.
The third condition was that they just saw pictures of the items that were part of the shopping. So they saw like store windows with these items in them rather than someone shopping, because they wanted to eliminate the effect of, is it just having a human?
Okay.
Right?
Right.
So they had one where it was just the objects and no human. So what they found was that the girls who'd read, I'll tell you what they did to like find out what they, how the girls viewed bodies. So they had girls fill in, they had like a bunch of bodies along the top section of a piece of paper. And then they had another group of the same bodies along the bottom part. And they said, on the top one, I want you to put what you look like. So fill it in, color it in with this crayon. And then on the bottom one, I want you to choose the body that you wish you looked like. Color it in. And then they subtracted those two scores. So each of them had like a score. So they subtracted it. So a lower number would mean that you're very dissatisfied and want to be thinner. A more equal number would be that you're pretty satisfied. So your body you think is your ideal body as well.
Right.
And a high number would be that you wish that you were bigger.
Okay.
And what they found was that the girls in the MA condition and in the storybook that didn't have any people in it, both of those, they were quite satisfied with their body.
So near zero for most of them.
And for the Barbie, they were, it was a negative number. The average was negative 0.76.
Okay, not as bad as I thought you were gonna say, but still not good.
I guess it's one story, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's over one session.
Yeah.
It's not
I gotcha.
over like weeks or something like that.
I see.
So the one shot story led to a negative 0.76.
We can mess up girls so fast you won't even believe it.
So yeah, I think, it shows that manipulation, right? So they know kind of the cause and effect here. They gave each girl a story, right? And didn't give them different kinds of information. And they manipulated this condition, right? and kept other things constant. So they still read a story.
Mm-hmm.
They still, other things were kept so that they wouldn't be the thing that affected it. And the reason why they did each condition, right? So you want the bigger doll with the Barbie doll, but you also want the different, if you'd found a difference between those, if you found a difference between Barbie and no doll at all,
mm-hmm.
then it could be that it's just humans being involved in the story,
right.
or, human-like characters being involved in the story. So that's why you need the MA doll to compare to the other conditions. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So I thought that was a pretty well-designed study. But like you said, negative 0.76, those averages,
mm-hmm.
how big are they? Are they significant? And in what way are they significant? So what do we decide to pay attention to? And how do we know that differences in group averages are worthy of that attention? So we use, in statistics for quantitative research, we use null hypothesis testing to determine whether mean differences among groups are greater than the differences that you would expect given the average error variation. And we use statistics to determine this. So usually statistical significance is set at 95% probability. But we must recognize that statistical significance is not the same thing as scientific or even clinical significance. So, is negative 0.76 going to change the way that we develop dolls and stories for children? Is it going to be clinically meaningful? Is it practically meaningful? Is it meaningful to science and the way that we're advancing our knowledge? So all these things are not equated.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, statistical power.
And they are determined by how much power we have to find differences. So statistical power refers to the likelihood that a statistical test will allow researchers to make the claims that they want to make based on statistical significance. And that's influenced by three things. The level that you've chosen for your statistical significance. Again, we don't really mess around with that. It's 95%.
That stays pretty fixed.
The size of the treatment effect, so the effect size.
You usually can't do much about.
You can't really do much about it except to choose like a robust measure or something like this. And the sample size.
There's the one we can change.
Yeah. So the primary way that we look to increase statistical power is to increase our sample size. But you'll see power analyses in a lot of research proposals, hopefully more in research publications, although I don't see that very often. Different way of doing research. So I talked about quantitative research for quite a while, I think, because there's a lot to kind of understand around that. It's got a lot of steps to it and a lot of different kinds of analyses, even though mathematically a lot of them can be equated. I think a lot of people find the quantitative analysis really difficult to understand, and also the way that you have to, again, methodologically design studies is really systematic and involves a lot of control, manipulation, all that kind of stuff. Qualitative research has its own challenges.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but it's a different kind of work.
Yeah. So qualitative research is the awareness of the diverse experience of individuals, and psychological qualitative research in particular forms a platform for exactly this, hearing the voices of the excluded.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So in this kind of work, researchers ask participants to describe their experiences in ways that are meaningful to them, rather than asking participants to kind of categorize themselves or use categories established by theories.
Yeah.
So, for example, there was a study, this one I think is the Kid and Crawl one, from 2002, I believe. And this one, was to gain insight into 29 Toronto street youth, ages 17 to 24 years, interviewed in 2002, and what they were really interested in was their experiences with suicide.
Yeah, I love the term street youth, by the way.
Street youth.
I hope that someday in my past, I hope someone referred to me as street youth.
Yeah, and I think I said Toronto wrong. It's Toronto, isn't it? Torontonians say Toronto.
Okay.
So qualitative research would do different things with the narratives around the experiences that these street youths have, kind of described. One way to do that is to look at kind of themes, a thematic kind of analysis. So in this study, they looked at the central themes in the narrative. So they looked across all the different quotes, all the different narratives, and then picked out themes that were coming up over and over again, right? So it's a very iterative process. Takes a lot of time. But they found 4 main themes: low self-worth, which was included in 74% of the narratives; isolation, which was in 61%; rejection and betrayal; and lack of control. And the authors presented the themes in this paper within the context that they were discussed in the interviews. So, for example, they looked at how often isolation appeared in discussion categories such as early childhood abuse. So how much did they say that early childhood abuse involved rejection and betrayal, isolation, and then gave quotes to give weight to that argument and to give evidence of what the person said in their own words. And I mean, one thing that they found was that there was a concept called kind of this slow suicide, where people's experiences really started to kind of accumulate, where they felt that there was a loss of control. There were things that people hadn't considered before, so assault during prostitution, drug abuse as being part of that slow suicide, breakups in intimate relationships being part of this kind of low self-worth, and rejection and betrayal. And it was, and a majority, 76% of those interviewed reported a history of, attempting suicide. And the narratives that they used were very revealing of a group of people that hadn't been looked at before in terms of like street youth. So what we understood about wanting to take your own life was expanded by this study, where we wouldn't have known about those given average levels.
You want to try and find something that you wouldn't find by coming to this with your own theory. Yeah,
exactly. So that's an example of that. So some high quality research can be done with things like interpretive phenomenological analysis. I think I said that right. Grounded theory, discourse analysis. Basically what they all do is to unpack the data. So they're unpacking those narratives and in a kind of deconstructed way. And they're searching for richness within those narratives. Looking for multiple meanings and themes within those. And these differ, so IPA and grounded theory and discourse analysis and thematic analysis, they differ in the way that they emphasize, at least this is my understanding of them, they differ in the way they emphasize the researcher being positioned within that trail of analysis. So some of them, I think IPA is one of them, you do an interview, really unpack it, look for the meaning, but then place yourself as a researcher within that to understand how to then do the next level of analysis. So there's kind of a dual process in it. You're really understanding the person's experience and trying to understand that, but you're also understanding your placement within that research context.
Right, much like a quantitative piece of research can never be totally free of bias. A qualitative piece of research has to be done by a human being. Yeah. Which means that, you do what you can to reduce.
Yeah, so you reflect after each of those. I mean, oftentimes, like my own trainees who are doing research like this, they after each interview, you realize where your biases were. I asked that question in a kind of leading way. What does that mean? how do I understand what their answers were based on the way that I asked the question, but also how do I grow as a researcher and make sure that I don't introduce that bias in the next interview. So it's very much, you don't say, oh, I messed that up, completely throw it out. I mean, it's an iterative process, and you work to understand it. And some of them, things like grounded theory work to then produce a model and a theory of what's going on. So it's very similar to the quantitative research. You're producing some kind of model of what you believe works in what way and what's the mediator. So it's not lower quality to do this qualitative research. You can come up with a model that would be maybe just as important as a model that we would have using that little diagram with poverty and chaos. Yeah.